Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. We're so thrilled to have you with us this afternoon. I'm Beth Chandler, President and CEO of YWCA, and I use the She series. Want to do a couple of things, make sure I get the housekeeping notes out of the way. So the first is that we will end promptly at 5:30. We will have a 10-minute break about 5 o'clock, and then we'll come back, have Q&A, and let you go. Second is that audience members can participate in a couple of ways. So certainly via chat, you can chat with each other, you can chat to us as well. And you can also raise your hand if you have a question. And I think the raise your hand feature is at the bottom of your screen. You can use the Q&A feature to ask questions of the panelists. So that will be monitored. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. We do have cart services for this event that are provided by Lindsay from Interpreters and Translators Incorporated. So Lindsay is here. If you have additional needs, please contact Tom Bragg, who you can chat in the chat feature. Just look for Tom so it doesn't go to everybody, and you can let him know if you have additional needs that we are not addressing. And I think that is it for my housekeeping notes. Want to do a land acknowledgement of the Massachusetts people on whose land our building is, and many of our staff reside, and many folks in Boston reside. I want to acknowledge the contributions that the Massachusetts people have made to the Commonwealth and acknowledge that their ancestral lands were taken from them. And it's important that we all remember the contributions of Indigenous people, as well as a reminder to think about all the folks who are not included in spaces that should be. I want to tell you a little bit about YWCA. So we were established in 1866 as the first YWCA in the country. Our mission is the same for all YWCAs, which is to eliminate racism, empower women, and promote peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. And our focus specifically here at YWCA is to be a thought leader at the intersection of race and gender, and to help organizations create more inclusive environments so that women, people of color, and especially women of color can thrive at all levels. And our work falls into three big buckets. First are our DEI services, which also includes a leadership program called LeadBoston. The second is our program for middle school girls called F.Y.R.E. And then our third bucket is advocacy work. So again, thank you for joining us this afternoon. We are thrilled to have you. I also want to acknowledge that the EOS Foundation was a big supporter of the work that we've done to put this event together and to actually create the data by funding a fellow for us to do that work. So I want to do a big shout out to the EOS Foundation for doing that, and also for Aminata Kaba, who was our fellow, who really did the yeoman share of putting the research together. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sarah F.Y.R.E, who is the Director of Research and Evaluation at YWCA, and she will share some of the highlights from the research. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Beth, and welcome everyone who is here and continuing to join. Very excited to see those numbers tick up. My name is Sarah F.Y.R.E. I use she, her, hers pronouns. As Beth said, I'm the Director of Research and Evaluation here at YWCA. And at YWCA, it's my job to help us understand if we are achieving our intended impact of making organizations in Greater Boston more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. And we largely pursue that through our programs, which Beth just highlighted. And we're working with individuals, working with organizations to change those policies, practices, attitudes, and behaviors so that women, people of color, and especially women of color can succeed at work. And we're focusing on this intersection of race and gender in all that we do at YWCA. But we knew that in order to think creatively and to continue to amplify the voices of women of color, we still have things that we need to learn more about, especially since DEI efforts are too often centered on full-time staff, decided in leadership or boardrooms, and informed by those who have privileged identities, we wanted to expand our understanding of what workers need and what they envision for their organizations. When we shared this ambition, the EOS Foundation generously funded a one-year fellowship for Aminata Kaba, who conducted this research project and wrote the white paper that are the foundation of this report presented tonight. She pushed us to focus and engage directly with those who are most excluded from decision-making, adversely impacted by policies and practices, and key to the success of many organizations, the hourly workers. Aminata's focus groups and interviews with 25 hourly workers in the Boston area reveals a familiar phrase to many in grassroots organizing. Those that are closest to the problem are also closest to the solution. As a sociologist and qualitative researcher on institutional inequality, I am thrilled that this study exists. Aminata's recruitment in this particular community, use of qualitative methods, and deep value of positionality and voice all elevate and legitimate the experiences of hourly workers. This study features the very voices we too often ignore or fail to include. I will soon pass things off to my colleague, Brianna Savage, our advocacy and community organizing manager. She supervised Aminata in this project and is excited to take you into the report itself, given that Aminata is unfortunately unable to present her findings directly today. But I do hope that you read this report, that you click on Aminata's video in the report so that you can hear from her directly, that you take actions on the recommendations offered by the participants of this project, and that you use the energy of today's conversation as a catalyst for change in your communities. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thank you everybody for being here. As Sarah and Beth alluded to, we have this fantastic report to introduce you all to if you have not read it already, and then afterwards we'll have a panel discussion with some fantastic panelists who are experts in this area. After that, we'll have the Q&A session, and we're so excited to share this with you. So I want to be sure to leave plenty of time for our panelists here to discuss the report, so I will briefly go through some of the major findings of this study. Expanding a bit on what Sarah was mentioning, we conducted this study to highlight the experiences of folks who are hourly workers of color with marginalized gender identities in particular. To recruit our participants, the researcher used social media, email outreach, cold calls, professional and academic connections, as well as physically flyering around Boston to recruit folks to participate in a brief survey about their workplace. One of the survey questions is here on the right, where you can see the responses. From there, our eligible respondents continued in the study by participating in focus groups and individual interviews. The lead researcher also conducted a literature review of some major Greater Boston area reports focusing on workplace equity to support these findings. What we discovered through this study was that there's 3 major areas to focus on in order to reach the goal of workplace inclusion for all employees, especially those included in our qualitative data collection. Hourly workers are more likely to be women and more likely to be people of color. So when we speak of the goal of workplace inclusion, we must use this lens of gender and racial equity. The report does go into more detail and examples, of course, ways to implement these proposed solutions, but in the slides that follow, I'll provide a brief overview to set the stage for our discussion to come. What's special about this report is that our researcher, Aminata, among sourcing her literature and other studies, highlighted the voices of our participants to be the centerfold of this research. Here we use this firsthand experience of those most impacted by organizational culture to recommend and to guide companies to a more equitable workplace. So here on the left, you'll see the darker text as an example of these challenges we discovered in our research. And on the right, in our persimmon orange, the proposed recommendation with more specific examples of how to implement that below. And so first, and maybe the simplest problem to solve, is inequitable pay. When participants were asked, if you had all the power at work, how would you make things better for yourself and your coworkers? Pay equity and pay transparency came up about half the time. Some participants disclosed their pain, their sense of betrayal, and fear upon learning that they were not earning what their peers were earning for the same work. Others shared the simple dream of no longer living paycheck to paycheck. And so we ask you to consider some of these quick fixes, these systemic issues to really address that issue. Another challenge that was brought to light was the disconnect between the intention of employers to build an inclusive workplace to the reality of employees actually feeling like they belong. Belonging is not only a social need, but also a workplace one. The absence of belonging or the absence of an identity safe workplace or a workplace where you feel at minimum secure in your many identities can have harmful effects to the business. This kind of culture can deter potential employees or talent seeking an opportunity to work with you, and quite possibly drive your existing workforce or employees to seek other opportunities. Without belonging, your employees feel lower organizational commitment and engagement. What our study has shown is that even small chances to check in or create a space for discussion about the workplace can nurture a sense of bonding and connection between employee and employer, which therefore improves business functions and operations. Throughout this research, we saw the theme of distance between hourly workers and decision makers at their organizations. Many participants said that they were neither consulted nor considered in decisions about their workplaces, which had them feeling less engaged and frankly disheartened and disillusioned by the work. This distance was demonstrated by exclusion of operational decisions like schedules, but also included broader DEI conversations, DEI being diversity, equity, inclusion, or company culture initiatives. Without a seat at the table or an opportunity to communicate their point of view to management and colleagues, participants found it hard to be confident in their own leadership in their own work. This lack of trust was especially the case when it came to DEI initiatives and strategies. This hierarchical imbalance is based on presumed values of different roles instead of the actual value of diverse perspectives for an organization. Participants who felt included and heard were more engaged in all parts of their jobs and more committed to their organizations, which, as we know, impacts the success of a business. So we urge you to consider making tables, making seats, committees, whatever it is, to uplift all the voices of the organization and create a more engaged and diverse collaboration. As we've all seen in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been a significant change in job requirements and execution. For example, this webinar is virtual and happening from the comfort of many of our homes. Frontline workers and hourly workers in particular faced this increased pressure during the pandemic and subsequent wave of remote work. These workers were more likely to stay working in person and were sent back to work during the height of the pandemic. Their roles proved to be essential and could not be performed remotely. At the same time, other workers, mostly salaried, gained more control over their schedules, shortened their commutes, and gained increased trust from their managers that they could do their jobs remotely. Where a lot of workers were granted more flexibility and confidence in their work, too many of our hourly workers faced more rigid requirements, thus increasing this divide between those who were trusted to work independently and those who were not. Simple policies such as hybrid options, flexible hours, even gating an hourly schedule in advance can support mental health, decrease distractions, increase creativity, increase productivity, decrease tardiness, and increase the ability to manage other responsibilities like caregiving. Another theme that emerged through our research was this deficiency in leadership support of hourly workers, especially those of color and from marginalized gender identities. The participants in this project were clear in their ambition and their dedication to hard work and success, but felt like they were not considered key members of their teams and that they lacked the support to get there. This absence of authority was seen in unresponsive and unavailable managers, in canceled or deprioritized supervisory meetings, and in absent or untrusted human resource representatives. These workers did not have clear objectives or guidance from their managers about what their job was or how to do it well, which is, we can all understand, to be extremely frustrating and disheartening. To address these absences, our research suggests providing proper management training and a clear role of human resources with training specifically on how to hear and include hourly workers and workers from all roles and backgrounds. This increased access to management and increased transparency to employee resources can foster a workplace of trust rather than of fear and frustration. As I'm sure is clear so far, these participants, as a representation of hourly workers in Massachusetts, have a strong desire for professional growth, and more specifically, professional growth supported and instituted by their employer. The need to work with supervisors to identify next steps for development so that there is a need to work with supervisors and identify next steps for development so that there can be high-performing employees with increased skill sets on their way to advance their careers. Instead, what this research is telling us is that there's a lack of resources for professional development and little to no investment in employees to grow. Additionally, when workers took it upon themselves to increase their skills with outside resources or classes, it did not change their positions or their pay. Instead, it felt like extra work for nothing in return. Rather than recruiting, hiring, and training new employees, which can be expensive and exhausting, invest in the skilled, experienced, and most importantly, the eager employees that you now have at your organization. Finally, through our research, we identified this last challenge and opportunity to increase workplace equity. There are inadequate levels of praise, and worse, there are biased systems of recognition in place at many organizations and companies. What this does is show hourly workers that they are not acknowledged, let alone praised for their work. Recognition for effort and quality of work are important components of employee engagement, morale, and retention. Participants described too many of them either did not have the opportunities to be recognized or found that the same people were recognized over and over again, mostly being white and or male staff members. By assessing your culture of recognition, or perhaps lack thereof, you can start to recognize where biases may have infiltrated systems. A culture of informal or formal feedback can cultivate higher quality work, deepen relationships between colleagues, and decrease silos and inefficiencies among teams. So finally, I will say thank you to all of our amazing partners and participants who helped shape this report, some of them being here on this slide. Thank you very much for that. And we are extremely grateful for the chance to amplify the voices of these participants. As Beth and Sarah pointed out, I hope what this brief overview of this report shows is that inclusion, and specifically belonging, is not only a possibility, but a necessity in Greater Boston. So now I challenge you, we urge you, our participants ask you to read this report, to share these findings, to listen to these voices, and to make a change for the better. Maybe it's one step, one action, one day of a more inclusive and positive change, but it is a step towards increasing your equity and belonging in your workplace, and it is possible. Thank you so much. Now I'll move over and pause there to hand it over to Beth, our president and CEO, who will facilitate this wonderful panel.
Thank you, Brianna. That was really appreciate what you shared in the findings. And I have the honor of introducing our panel this afternoon. First, I'd like to introduce Karen Groce-Horan, who is the founder of Courageous Conversations and is a lifelong equity and justice advocate. We also have with us Dr. Samuel Bradley. Dr. Bradley is an assistant professor at Boston College, specializing in equity, justice, and inclusion. And certainly last but not least, we have Diane Gould. Diane is the president and CEO of Advocates and Family Continuity and has been a leader of support services that promote empowerment, inclusion, and health equity. I want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon, and I will say I am happy we are doing it via Zoom, given the crazy weather we've had today. So my first question is for all three of the panelists. I'd love to hear what resonated for each of you when you read this report. And I'll start with Karen and then ask Dr. Bradley and then finally Diane to answer that question.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, YW and EOS for this incredible research. I think one of the things that struck me right off was the courage and bravery that these participants undertook to give this qualitative information and really helpful insights, using their names, basically, in their places of employment or their sector. Good for them. They stepped up bravely and gave some really valuable insights that really do enforce the pillars of, equitable and inclusive culture in organizations. So good for them. And it's really a wonderful moment. I love the qualitative narrative. I have to say, so often we're doing research that gives us the data points and it's quantitative, and that doesn't always work for everyone, or sometimes it's a combination of both. I really love that aspect of this report and feel like it just gives you a whole different insight and way to take on some of the objectives that the report highlights. And I'll also, highlight that I think building those inclusive processes, like that's the bottom line. Organizations have to find ways to include the voices of everyone in their organization. And, high tides raise all boats. So if we're doing all those things for women and for people of color and for LGBTQ and IA plus gendered, we're going to do well for everyone. Everyone wins when we're achieving accomplishments and inclusive and equitable practices for those on that part of our workforce.
Great.
So with that, I'll pass on to Sam to give some of his wisdom as well.
Thanks, Karen. And also big thank you to Beth, to Diane, to the entire team that put this the work in to get us to this point. We recently completed the study on national workplace equity in the Work Equity Project at the Boston College School of Social Work. And, it strikes me that this is not easy. To Karen's point, going out and doing the research, finding the group, and the brave participants, I think it really highlights, one, the deep interest that many of us have in work. We'll spend a significant portion of our lives at the workplace. And then two, the deep discontent, should I say, that many of us experience also at work when we realize that justice are not necessarily a part of the equation when we first show up, right? A lot of us are hoping to find a place where we feel included, we feel a sense of belonging. And unfortunately, many of us face circumstances in which that's not the case. Personally, I think about my own family, right? Growing up and seeing many family members who are hourly employees taking shift work. And guess what? You get your schedule on a Thursday and you're expected to figure out childcare by next week, right? And the enormous pressures that puts on so many folks, particularly communities of color, and particularly folks who have marginalized gender identities. A quick note about the report itself. I think it's gorgeously designed and beautifully written. And a few things that float to the top for me, especially as they resonate with our own findings in the National Study for Workplace Equity, were the mentions of workplace flexibility themselves, right? Handing workers opportunities to be able to flexibly figure out what their scheduling is particularly helpful for, I always think about caregivers, but helpful for so many of us in a variety of different ways. Also, the focus on or recommendation toward inclusive decision-making, I think, are paramount. And I'll tell you why. I know I'm talking for a little bit longer, Beth, but if you'll stick with me, I will say that our research was conducted nationally. We surveyed 1,062 US workplaces. We were able to get a strong understanding because we surveyed across multiple kinds of sectors to really, I'm going to say something a little bit controversial here, findings that indicate a somewhat stalled DEI movement. 1 in 4 of the respondents of the organizations that we surveyed indicated that their employees had experienced bias. And in particular, we saw that 28% of respondents indicated bias surrounding gender and 27% bias with regards to race and ethnicity. That's a big standout number. And when we're thinking about how these employees are experiencing these things, I would encourage us to think systemically across all of the many ways that employees will pass through an organization. If you think about the time that they spend there, almost like a kind of life cycle, from the way that we create and design the job themselves. Is there any workplace flexibility built into it? Are employees able to decide the how, when, and where of their work? Do they have any sense of autonomy? Also mentioned in the report. Are employees compensated fairly? Do benefits only apply for salaried employees and not hourly workers? And are some of us really getting sweetheart deals, right? Like where only 1 or 2 hourly or favored hourly employees are getting particular chances to control their scheduling. You know, these things are really important conversations around justice. And so I just wanted to say a big thank you to YW for inviting me here. And I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Bradley. And then Diane, what resonated with you from the report?
Thank you. Like my colleagues, I also want to acknowledge and thank the efforts of the YW Boston. I think it's a really beautifully done report and tremendously informative. There was a lot in it that resonated for me as the leader of a nonprofit human service agency. We employ about 56% of our employees are people of color. 76% of those people are hourly workers in our organization, and the majority of them are women. Many of them, I think maybe I'll start just by saying something that was also included in the report, that in many ways, hourly workers are the backbone of our organizations and the backbone of our communities. And the least valued of the members of our communities. Many of our employees, because of the nature of the roles, do not have control over whether they are working in person or remotely, because they're working in group residential programs, providing supports to people with disabilities, substance use challenges, mental health conditions, and the work is in person. There's not a choice about working remotely. Pay certainly resonated, the need for people to be better paid, better compensated, better benefited. The connection to leadership also resonated. We hear a lot from our employees that they want our leadership to be closer to them. And so maybe later I can talk a little bit about some of the strategies we've used. The pathways to promotion I thought was particularly interesting because there's some way that the pathways to promotion have not been clear nor transparent. One of the things that our employees have said is that for people of color, the goalposts move. They think they know how to get a promotion, but then, and they do those things, but then it seems like the goalposts move for them. And so we're doing a lot on examining, you know, the nature of the roles, the compensation, the salary bands, and real transparency and accountability regarding what it takes to be promoted. We recently got a workforce grant that's all about career ladders focused on people of color. And so I have more to say about strategies, but I don't think that question is on the table yet. So those are some of the things, some of the many things that resonated for us in the report.
That's great. Well, you know, Diane, we can talk a little bit about strategy since you mentioned it. And so I'll start with you and then work backwards. And I'd love at least initially to think about middle managers. That came up a lot in the report. From the work that we do at YW, it is, you know, middle managers often come up regardless of level, whether it's, you know, hourly employees, salary employees, that middle managers are a sticking point. So I'd love to hear some strategies that either you've used in your workplaces and or that you've seen successful maybe through your research, Dr. Bradley in particular, for how middle managers can really help to support hourly employees.
So the first thing that comes to mind for me is really taking in and digesting and using reports like this and really listening to the voices of hourly workers and creating spaces, and we would call them brave spaces, for people to be able to speak about their concerns, their needs, and then responding to those needs. I think that bringing middle managers and hourly workers closer together. A couple of comments have already been made about having a seat at the table, and so at the decision-making table. And I think we've taken some steps to promote not only seats at the table, but paid seats at the table. We have employee resource groups here at Advocates for Black and Brown staff, for members of the LGBTQIA+ community, for white anti-racist allies. A number of these folks who participate are hourly workers. We want to be sure that they're paid when they're invited to participate in a committee or when they choose to participate in an employee resource group, and that their voices are elevated to middle management, up through middle management to executive leadership. Also, I think there's a lot of work in the nonprofit sector advocating for rates that will result in better pay for the hourly workers, and the engagement of the entire organization in advocacy regarding those rates has been, I think, important and in some success, and empowering for all of the staff here.
Great. And Dr. Bradley, what strategies have you either seen through your research or have employed yourself that help middle managers strengthen a connection with particularly hourly workers? You're on mute, sir.
2 years on Zoom and I'm still doing it. Thanks a lot. I'm looking at the squares. I'm looking at Karen because she gave me my first big break. Back in the Work Equity Project at the School of Social Work, we do something called the Equity Innovation Lab, which has really helped us to shine a spotlight on what works and to understand, some of the mechanisms internally within organizations. And so what we do is we have a team that goes into organizations and partners with their DEI lead and their executives, and we use design thinking to help us understand, doing more sort of root cause analysis and really looking towards how can we really affect change systemically within organizations. So I'm gonna cheat a little bit, and I'm gonna answer your question in two ways. The first way is sort of the larger strategy at organizations, and that's really the part that I'm most interested in my research, have to do with simply setting roles and accountability, right? When we're looking at across the different experiences that employees might have, again, from the way that we design the job itself, to hiring and recruitment, to compensation and benefits, to career development and training, to promotions, and even to separation, because we'll all eventually separate from an organization that we're working at in one way or another. It really, I think, is important and incumbent upon all of us. And I'm thinking mostly about small and medium-sized organizations where, they don't have several large offices for recruitment and DEI and all these things are separate, but instead really thinking inside of your organization, who can we appoint as a leader in this area to really be thinking systemically about different areas, not just one, not just two, but again, identifying different aspects of the employment systems and really thinking through how can we assign someone so that they're providing some sort of accountability around how we do hiring and recruitment, how we focus on, job structures and workplace flexibility. All of those things, I think, meaningfully contribute to the overall organization, especially at a time when workers are oftentimes asking for more accountability around, I keep thinking about the anti-racism statements that were, all over the place just a few summers ago. And where are we at in reporting those things now, right? And not only reporting our commitment to our external constituents, but our internal ones, if we think of our employees as a kind of constituency on its own. I get passionate about this, and I think about it so deeply because I was a social worker in New Orleans training in 2012, 2013. And one of the things that struck me so much was that we had such incredible hearts for the mission, maybe not always incredible hearts for the employees who carry out those missions every day. And it really made me passionate about this particular topic. The other thing I'll say is real boring, but coming from a researcher is probably, don't turn off your cameras on me yet. Evaluate, right? If we are not performing internal audits, and asking middle managers to do that, to be a part of that, to help us see any gaps in the policies that currently exist, and to helping us build new policies, then we're really sort of only piecemeal hoping to create the change that we're really wanting to see, for our hourly workers. And so if we can really think about, not only setting policies that allow for more flexible workplaces, but also focusing on evaluating how we're doing. And shout out to YW, who I know it has an audit attached to this report as well. Over in the Work Equity Initiative, we're also working on building a set of toolkits across 10 employment systems that we think will also be helpful. These things, I think, have a really important place in the future of workplace equity. So we can build teams, again, flush with people who have different roles and accountabilities, who are consistently auditing these systems on a regular basis, and in communication with employees, helping to build, again, that bridge to more flexible workplaces.
Thank you, Dr. Bradley. And Karen, how would you suggest, what are some strategies to help strengthen the relationship between middle management and hourly employees?
Yeah, thanks for putting me after Dr. Samuel Bradley. I said it just about as well as it can be said, but having been a part of that innovative lab experience in some of the DEI consulting work that I've done with organizations, that process was invaluable, and it allowed us to look at those systems of workplace structure, do a compensation analysis, look at the job market career study, where are our jobs lining up? Are they in line with the market, both in responsibilities, roles, and accountabilities, but also the compensation? And then do a job function study within the organization to see what everyone is doing, and is there too much on this person's plate, and why are we all so overburdened with work if we're taking on roles that should allow us to do our work within 32 to 40 hours a week. That just isn't always true. So doing those kinds of studies and analysis will lead to an equitable culture, and people will know that they're cared for and that the company, this matters to a company. And I'll also say one other thing, that a strategy that emerged from the innovative process that we underwent with Dr. Bradley and his colleagues was implementing a strategy for mental wellness. We are so heavily involved and emphasize the physical and, benefits and all, but you know what? We all know after what we've been through the last almost 4 years now, we have to pay attention to the workplace mental wellness, and we need to have conversations that we break down the stigmas that surround it, because this is the reality of the workplace, and we have to have a workplace that's psychologically safe. So that's a big one for me, and across the spectrum of all careers. Let's build that career ladder so the hourly employees, whether they're mentored or they have that advocacy from their middle manager, that they see a pathway to the top, that they're not just there as an hourly worker, that people care about their growth, development, and opportunity within the career structure.
I'd love, Beth, this is Diane. I'd love to add a couple of things if I could. I'm really interested in what both Dr. Bradley and Karen said just now. A couple of things. One is about measurement and evaluation, and a pathway to the top. For us, I think having people of color in leadership is a signal to the organization and to the many people of color who are hourly workers that it's possible to advance in this organization. They can see people who look like them at the most senior levels in the organization. And one way we did that was through a policy that we don't hire anyone from senior leadership up without first having a pool of candidates that include people of color. And that has helped us turn the dial somewhat on the number of people of color in leadership. The other thing I wanted to note is that we've been working in partnership with YW as consultants to the organization for the last couple of years. And a couple of things have come out of that, including this attention to basic needs, adequate pay, certainly, for those people who have loans, student loan repayment, an opportunity to access their pay early, an employee emergency fund, a no interest loan opportunity, just a number of, a membership in BJ's that's vastly reduced the cost for people. So just a number, like really listening to what matters most and then trying to build in strategies. There's a lot about retention. We have some strategies to recruit people, but then how do we ensure that they stay? And just two quick things about mental wellness and emotional well-being. Many of the people who are in this category of workers have experienced racial trauma at work. So we just now engaged a group that does provides education and support to workers who've experienced racial trauma in the workplace. That may have happened at Advocates, it may have happened elsewhere, but we're making that available to people, as well as employee resources that are culturally responsive to the workforce. Thank you.
Great. And anyone else want to add to that before I move on? I want to make sure I give Dr. Bradley, if you have anything to add, voice to that.
I just think that those are really great practices. And I think, I applied the consistent effort to do something when I come into contact a lot with nonprofit organizations in this space. Sometimes there can be a sense of being stuck, like we're not quite sure how to move forward. And I tell folks that even if you don't have an equity innovation lab with professional designers in it, gathering together as a group and doing something, right? Like moving forward, I think is important. And then what's clearly emerged from Advocates is this culture of continuous improvement and change in this area. And I think that's to be applauded. And I think for all of the listeners who have hourly employees, that is a place to start, right? Just to do something, I think is an important message that I would add to that.
And I'll also share, I think the examples Diane gave were terrific of the things that she and her team are doing at Advocates. And it didn't sound like all of them had a huge financial cost to them either. And I think that's also something to note, is that often, we hear from organizations, well, it costs too much to do this, or it costs too much to do that. And there are strategies that you can employ that actually don't have a huge dollar benefit, but can be extraordinarily rewarding to staff. So I do think it's really important to do those listening circles, to hear what staff need and figure out, what can you do, because it may not be as expensive as people think. I'm going to switch a little bit. Another point that came up in the report was this sense of belonging. And I think Dr. Bradley in his comments talked about the deep discontent in the workplace. And that certainly is not just with hourly employees. I think we see it almost up the ladder. But given some of the unique challenges for hourly employees, what are some things that you all can recommend that organizations think about for helping with that sense of belonging for hourly employees? And I throw it out to anyone that would like to take it.
This is Diane. We've been having some conversations just in the last couple of weeks. We have long had, for about 12 years, had a part-time chief diversity officer, and then expanded that to DE&I, and we just changed the role to full-time. And the person who came in, his name is Promise Machenga, came in and said, "This is, I would like the role to be chief DEINB for belonging officer." And so we've been talking some about what does it actually mean? What is the concept of belonging, and how does an organization promote it? I do think that this concept of seat at the table and voices that are elevated and roles in decision-making, as opposed to being like having a principle that decisions are made with the input of those who are going to be impacted by them. And here we would say both the hourly workers and the people we support. I feel like we have a long way to go on that front. We're an increasingly diverse organization. We're doing a lot. We're doing a number of things on the equity and inclusion front, but this concept of belonging, I think, is another I don't want to say another phase exactly, but it's something that I think we need to be more focused on and really get our arms around. And I'd love to hear from my colleagues on this. It would be helpful to me and to us.
Yeah, I'll say when I talk about belonging and DEI, I talk about the three circles of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how they overlap and how they have to overlap. And in the center there, where all three come together, where we have diversity, we have inclusion, we've got equity within our organization, that creates that sense of belonging, that people feel they can show up, they can bring as much of themselves as they feel is needed to do their job and to be a part of that, transformational culture is truly what it is. But if we bring people of diverse perspectives, racial identities, and intersectional perspectives to an organization that doesn't have equity, doesn't have inclusion, it's going to be a revolving door. So we have to have that equity, those cultures of inclusion to overlap there with the diversity to create that sense of belonging. So that is one thing that highly emphasize as I do the consulting work in these practices, and it really is just part of the work.
Right. And are there any suggestions on a couple of things that people might want to keep in mind when it comes to this sense of belonging? I understand that it needs to have all three to get to that sense of belonging, but particularly with the hourly workers, is there something you would tell folks to really focus on making sure?
Yeah, I think it's important, like when we're developing strategy, when we're developing goals and objectives for a year for an organization, involve people of the hourly workers, across the whole spectrum of our workforce, to be involved in those conversations so that they feel a part of the process and they can speak with their colleagues. The hourly workers ask hourly workers, like, what do we need to be doing to be contributing to the strategy, the growth and the development of the organization? It just has to be built in. It's essential. Otherwise, they will always feel left out and excluded. And I think also, have ongoing conversations. They're challenging, but they have to happen, and organizations need to take that on, if not quarterly, monthly, to just enable and create that space where people can come to it, bring themselves, have those conversations about these really challenging topics, and it creates that trust that needs to be in place and foundational to doing the work with agency and conviction. So those are a couple of suggestions that I would have. And also, make work fun, make it a place that people want to come to. Maybe are we in the workplace 2 days a week? Like, let's have a Monopoly challenge or some kind of game we play at lunchtime. Make it a fun place for people to want to be.
Thank you, Karen. And Dr. Bradley, I see you're off of mute.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts come to mind. I agree with both of my panelists for sure. And I think, when I talk to my students, I think about this in a couple of ways, right? When we talk about the allocation of resources, especially when we're thinking about compensation and benefits, which is a major aspect of the report, is it distributive, right? And we all are challenged, I think, in this area, right? Are hourly employees getting paid at the same base hourly rate as their salaried full-time employees, right? At many places, that's not the case. And so thinking through, how does that show up, when employees are looking sort of across the line at each other and they're like, well, you're the one getting the bigger paycheck, right? Like, and what that does to someone's sense of belonging, right? I also think about justice in terms of procedures. Do we actually have policies and practices and procedures in place that help us to understand things like how I go to HR, what things I can go to HR for, who's responsible and accountable if I need to file a grievance about a bias incident that happened at work? Have those people been introduced to me? Is the information that I need available so that I can actually find these things and do it, right? And then I think the last thing that I'll say is really about being treated with a sense of dignity and respect. We can oftentimes talk about those things, but I wonder to what degree do we also listen to employees when they're coming to us, or are we building a list of reasons why we cannot do something, right? And so just thinking through, when we talk about treating other folks with a sense of dignity and respect or belonging, that means making decisions that are maybe not always what you would have done for everybody. It means listening. It means democratic decision-making styles, and all of this, like I want to say, I fully understand, is bucking a little bit of the tradition of the hierarchies that we typically build in organizations for quick, fast decision-making, which is why I'll leave you with this thought, which is that time is a big factor. I mean, it's built into the title, right? We're talking about hourly workers, right? And so when hourly workers show up for a 4-hour or 8-hour shift or what have you, oftentimes we use the finite or discrete time set on their clocks as a reason why we can't do something or why we can't engage in that longer conversation or discussion. And so I would also challenge us to be thinking about ways in which we build in time for relationship making, right? As an important aspect of creating that sense of belonging in the workplace.
Great. Thank you. Question again for all three of you. How if anything, have you seen any changes given that we are in this sort of weird environment post-COVID? Because we're not really post-COVID. So we haven't gone back to this sort of time that was pre-COVID, right? And we're not in the acute COVID time, but we're still in this sort of weird space. And so I was just wondering if there are anything, or if there are things that you've seen that seem exacerbated, perhaps because we're still in this interesting time, and what organizations may want to think about. And for me, for example, I think the mental strain and challenges that people are feeling, I think, have been exacerbated by this state that we're in that is not really post-COVID or, acute COVID, but I think it still, brings a lot of stress. I don't know if there are other things that you're seeing and how we can be mindful, particularly of how this might even be compounding challenges faced by hourly employees.
I'll just say real quick that, again, thanks to Karen, we were able to survey in conjunction with the United Way 178 organizations locally, and I won't call names, but one of the things that showed up, and that was at the height of the pandemic, and one of the things that showed up in our research was we were able to look at self-reported measures of organizational resilience alongside self-reported measures of workplace inclusion. And because we were using a very similar survey, the exact survey actually that we used in the National Workplace Equity Study, we were able to see that as organizations became more diverse and had higher scores in our organizational equity index, they also had higher scores around organizational resilience. And so while that doesn't tell a story necessarily about the individual worker, what it is highlighting is in places where we're seeing, more equity in the workplace, we're also seeing organizations that are having they're able to navigate more turbulent business environments. And this is a finding that also resonates with some other findings that we've seen out there around more diverse and inclusive teams perform a little bit better or much better when it comes to things like moving things to market, resolving conflict. And so those things are really at the top of mind when I think about this, is that the organization benefits because the employees are more engaged and are happier, but also the organization itself is doing better in those kinds of environments.
Great.
That's helpful, Sam. Yeah, I'll just say, I think a couple of things that come to mind for me are really specifically working against white dominant culture and how it shows up in behaviors within our organization. So coming up with a program where we talk about our failures or our mistakes and what we learned from them, instead of expecting that perfection. Let's admit that we've learned from mistakes and sharing those very outwardly and very leaving a space in staff time to talk about some of those learning opportunities, and also creating, as we build the trust, that 360-degree feedback, which I think is really essential, and eventually getting to that really equitable workplace where the feedback goes in all directions and we don't just feel the punitive aspects of a review value that comes handed down top to bottom. And I think another thing is perhaps requiring middle managers and supervisors to take mental health first aid. So they understand, they start to see signs, they know how to talk about that with the people that report to them. I think that's a really critical understanding that we need to build the muscle of within the organizations.
Great. And Diane?
Yeah, just a couple of comments. Thank you. Really appreciated the comments of my colleagues. I'm really intrigued by the organizational resilience, organizational equity kind of metric, and would love to learn more about that. It makes me think of the business case for DEI and V work. Also, what you said, Karen, about white dominant culture, and Sam, what you said about time and how in our organization and in this sector, the human services sector, there's a lot of urgency. There was huge urgency in the pandemic because many people were sick and a lot of people died. And the hourly workers were taking care of those people through that extraordinary time. There's not that quality of urgency today, but the pace of the work is very fast and doesn't, without being intentional, and we struggle with this, that kind of pace doesn't leave a lot of room for the kind of relationship building, the thoughtful and deep conversations, the deep listening. There are also some of these workers I'm about to comment on are hourly, some are salaried, but some of our work is clinic-based, and there are productivity expectations that are part of the financial model. And that is a recipe for stress and strain. There are also, in terms of white dominant culture, there are pressures that the organization creates that may not be necessary. And so finding ways to look at those and maybe change those. And then there are pressures that come from outside the organization that are legislative or regulatory or bigger system policy, and finding our way through how can we influence those, being explicit inside the organization, what's about advocates and what's about external. Let's look at the advocate stuff and see what may be changeable, maybe, see what we can change. And let's look at the external things that are being imposed and see where we might exercise influence. Thanks.
Yeah, and I will just add, I think being in a hybrid environment also creates this false sense of urgency and lack of time, right? Because when you had to go to a meeting or if you had to go see a client physically, you had time built in to do that, right? Now we can schedule things back to back if we have the luxury of being able to work remotely, where we're not scheduling downtime, we're not scheduling even bathroom breaks, right? We're putting meetings back to back. And so that also, I think, compounds things. We are just about at the top of the hour. So we are going to have a 10-minute break right now and then come back with Q&A. So I'm going to ask people to come back, get our panelists back on screen, and hopefully others that are listening can come back as well. We've got some really outstanding questions for our panelists. And so I want to try to get through as many of them as I can and be mindful of our time to be mindful of ending on time for folks. I'm going to give Diane just another second so we are able to hear her responses as well. Wonderful. All right, so panelists, thank you. I hope everyone had an opportunity to stretch, maybe get a drink of water, hopefully not necessarily a cocktail quite yet, even though it's after 5. So our first question, it's from one of our attendees, and they said, they appreciate all that everybody has to share and that this is overwhelming. Trying to think of all the things that were raised as potential tactics and strategies to address issues that arose by hourly workers. So if an organization hasn't yet started this journey of really being intentional about hourly employees and supporting their connection and engagement with the organization, where should they start? Where's a place where they might want to focus their initial step as they start doing this work?
I'll start in quick because I know Sam will have some good insight, and Diane as well, having done those things in both your organizations. You know, I think an audit is the place to start and see where you're at, kind of get that temperature check, and then prioritize, because it takes time and it moves at the speed of trust. So you can't do it all at once, but set some priorities, and that audit will really help focus in on those areas that are a good place to start for your organization.
Dr. Bradley or Diane, anything to add to that?
I would add, I think that is the place to start, and kind of getting a read on the current state. I'd also, I think, add focus groups that could be part of an audit, but listening circles, places where leadership is saying to the hourly worker, we want to know from you what is most important to you. We'd like to, support you, raise you up, and we want to develop strategies that are going to be responsive to what's most important to you, and you're the people who know, and then really listen.
Great, thank you. Dr. Bradley, I saw you come off mute.
Thanks, Beth. And thanks to Karen and Diane for leading. I explicitly trust, their approaches, and I think that they're well informed. The only thing I think I can add here is to say, don't do this work in isolation. There's no reason to, whether that means starting a DEI council, or whether that means you bring in some trusted managers and a few hourly workers, and you start just sitting in an office and talking, right, about what's going on. And I think, there's this sort of fear sometimes that, like, oh, the employees are huddled together, they're going to they're going to start a coup or something. But I think leadership would be wise to really think about, we have now emerging business cases around why this is so important for a variety of reasons. And employees want to help. They're showing up. They're giving you their time, and they want to make the places where they are better. And so gathering together and forming an equity committee, being sure that even if, for instance, you're just arriving, maybe you're the executive director or you're a chief diversity officer, you're trying to figure out where to start at. I agree with all the comments above. Starting with conversations with people is the most important thing that you can do. And I will also amplify Karen in saying, and then an audit, right? Like, let's evaluate what's happening, because we don't assess, we then can't evaluate any new programs that we implement. And so then how do we know that what we're trying to do is actually effective? And so I think that's also a really important aspect of the work too.
Great. And I'll just add one piece to that. I also think it's important to, do an audit and capture the information, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, so you can also share why you're starting where you're starting, right? You can't tackle everything, as the question said. It's a large area, right? When you think about DEI and all the places you can start. So your audit can help you determine where the biggest gaps are. And that's what you can also share with employees. That's why you're starting where you're starting, because that's where the biggest gaps are. So that also helps people understand why you're not necessarily tackling everything, because that's impossible. But you can say, here's what we've heard and or what we're seeing. So this is how we're going to start our journey. There was a question that was around evaluation tools. I think Dr. F.Y.R.E can certainly put some tools for folks in the chat. And if there are tools that Diane, Karen, or Dr. Bradley, you want to share, please feel free to just share some tools now. But Dr. F.Y.R.E will also put some tools in the chat for people. So any tools that come to mind quickly for you all?
I think, I'm excited to see the YW tool and what Dr. F.Y.R.E puts into the chat. We are currently working on building a set of 10 employment system toolkits that will help you to be able to perform an audit and also move through an innovation and program planning process throughout the 10 employment systems that are listed in our report. Beyond that, I think that there are some other, I'm going to probably, I don't even want to say the names because I'm going to probably mess them up and offend somebody, but I would go, think about Googling, diversity indexes, equity audits, those sorts of things. I think partly one of the reasons why I'm excited about what Dr. F.Y.R.E is putting in the chat about YW, as well as the work that we're doing, is I also, found myself in search of accessible tools that were sort of easier to read through, but also didn't require me to necessarily engage a consultant to build something for my organization. And I think many of us probably find ourselves in those positions. So these kinds of audits that we're starting to see, I think, are really invaluable for this work.
Great. Diane?
Yeah, we have been the grateful beneficiaries of the YW Boston's expertise in this area. And so I defer to my colleagues on the call and at the YW on this. I think that also Dr. Bradley's comment about you don't have to do this work alone, because engaging other organizations that are also on this path, separate and apart from or in addition to consultants, can provide a wealth of information. There are a lot of agencies, at least in our sector, doing this work now, and I think we can draw on each other for support.
Dr. F.Y.R.E, you had a couple of comments?
Sure, I was typing furiously, but it was not coherent. My brain and my fingers were not aligning, so thank you. And thank you, Diane, for just uplifting. Part of what I was going to say is that we use a mixed methods survey to look at individual perspectives at organizations. So you could think of this like a culture survey, but what that, of course, can mean a lot of things. What we think of it as is how individuals understand themselves, what motivates them, what behaviors how they show up to do equity work in their workplaces, their perspectives on whether or not this is worth it, whether or not it's challenging, whether or not they see their colleagues doing these things, their self-efficacy around these issues, as well as how would they sort of summarize the culture that they're swimming in. So do they see patterns of equity or inequity happening around promotions? Do they see issues of bias and prejudice happening in their workplaces? So both that looking inward to figure out what are those key levers of, since an organization is made up of individuals, how do we look at all those individuals in aggregate to say, all right, these folks are motivated when they have resources attached to it. These folks are motivated when they have the mission and the why connected to it, so that we can better understand those levers and use that to shift behavior. So for us, it's connected to our theory of change. For us, it's always connected to both the micro and the macro, and that sort of really tricky mezzo in the middle. And so that's maybe an unsatisfying answer if you wanted to link to a thing, but I encourage you to reach out to Shira to sort of see if we can partner with you or to follow up with me. I'll put my email in the chat as well, because the best thing for your organization is asking and listening to the folks at your organization on what they want to share with you. So having those open-ended, valuing that qualitative responses, those focus groups like Diane mentioned, having space for anonymous feedback so that folks can feel safe in order to share those hard truths that are both hard and risky for participants to offer, and often hard to receive as an organization, because no one, we hope, is running their organization or driving their organization to intentionally cause harm to their employees. We know that that undermines the very goals of any company, but we need to sort of figure out how to reconcile those two things.
Great. Thank you, Dr. F.Y.R.E. And if there are other tools that we are aware of, we can send them out with the recording, because we'll be sending out this information. So if any of our panelists have tools they want to share, send them our way and we'll make sure to compile them and send them out. Another question, and this is going to be a two-parter, and it's based on the mental wellness question. And so question is, one, Karen, if you could talk a little more about the mental health first aid. Is there a program out there that people can actually do or get trained in? And how should employers think about evaluating staff and defining mental health for staff? Because there's a question about, we could be throwing a lot of resources that aren't necessary because we don't know how to define it. So one is, how do you help define mental health for staff? And secondly, is there a class or something you can take on mental health first aid?
Yes. Great follow-up, and thank you for asking the question. I think one of the starting points for the work that I've seen done and I have helped consult with is bringing in a mental health advocate. And that would be, a professional, whether they're in the field of social work or psychological counseling, psychiatry, whatever that might be. They're really familiar with mental wellness in the workplace and emotional well-being. There is, and I'll give you, when we provide resources, I will provide the link for a practice in Boston that does do the mental health advocacy. They do mental health first aid training, and they set up advocates, within the organization that become those mental wellness coaches. And I will also say that, it's about determining a strategy. Like, there are many parts to the strategy. New York City did an incredible study on workplace mental health, and they have an excellent framework to structure from. So if you just Google New York City mental wellness and the mental health in the workplace, you'll find that guide. And that was one that I've used a framework from that has been very helpful, as because none of us know how to go about doing this work, but there are some really great models out there, and that's one of them that helped me frame the scaffolding for setting that kind of programming up.
Great, thank you. So this is a question that has come up, which is a great question, and it's the prevailing assumption is that hourly workers get less in organizations. Can we speak to why being an hourly worker might be beneficial or advantageous over being a full-time or salaried employee?
Flexibility. I think that sits at the heart of it. When we think about flexibility, it's not only, can we get to a 4-day work week, or can I compress my work, but also the ability to balance out other demands that exist in my life that go beyond, how people know me in the workplace, whether that is responsibilities for caregiving, whether that is your own mental health or physical health needs, other duties and obligations. The benefit is that people who are autonomous beings who have complex and rich lives get to make decisions about how their hourly work helps them to be able to facilitate other aspects of their life.
Great.
I would add to that overtime. One of the barriers to interest in advancement in an organization like ours is people are often advancing into salaried positions, which are better paid, but don't have the benefit of earning overtime. And so there are hourly workers in the human services sector that earn more than people who are more senior in their organizations, whose salaries are higher, but who don't have the benefit of overtime.
Great, thank you both. And then a question about creating brave spaces. And this has come up a couple times in our conversation, that we need to have brave spaces, places where people feel safe in sharing some things that might be challenging for folks in leadership to hear. So what are some strategies or steps that organizations can take to create brave spaces for people to feel more comfortable sharing what their needs are? And particularly those employees who are most vulnerable.
Absolutely. I'll take that one on, because this is, kind of the crux of the work that we do in working with organizations and towns. And we've worked with, a number of different organizations. And how do we set up, and how do we step into the space of those challenging conversations. And the most important part of that is creating a container where you can have those conversations, because we have to admit, this requires vulnerability. This is challenging and it's not easy. And we need to own that, but we need people to understand that they're within this container, there are no power dynamics. We will make mistakes. We need to not shame, blame, or be harmful to each other, but we need to listen and we need to be empathetic. So there are plenty of models on how to set up that container for space. And then we need to come up with discussion norms that really shape it and make clear what we can and can't do within this space. But it's challenging work and it's so worth it. And nothing good comes from things that come easy. So that's this is part of the work, and it's so important to do. And start with conversations that are maybe more storytelling. Like, tell us about a time when you first experienced racism. People love to tell their stories. They love to tell their stories of origin. So start with some basic things like that and build up to the, just had a critical race theory conversation last night, and boy, was that filled. So don't take on those hard ones right away. And in South Boston, we were working with the not-for-profits there, and they wanted to talk about busing and the remnants of busing. And I'm like, y'all are like learning to swim today and you want to be in the Olympics tomorrow. So you have to be really careful about how you build on the foundation of trust and learning and getting to know one another first.
Diane?
Yeah, the question makes me think about the employee resource group we have for Black and Brown staff. That was kind of co-created with a group of staff and the chief diversity officer. That it has co-conveners. People are paid to be there. Those who are interested, the co-conveners are paid to be there. There's an executive sponsor who's also a person of color who's part of leadership. And that's been running for a couple of years anyway, maybe 3 years. I would add to what you're saying, Karen, having agency over what gets communicated out and how, so that things have come up in this group and they have determined a way to get the concerns to leadership. And then the other thing I would add is once that happens, then real accountability for responding to the concerns that are coming up. So the brave and protected space, like agency over what gets shared and how and with whom, and then accountability for for solutions.
I couldn't agree more. Echo. I think if you ask folks, beware, you must listen. And so if you open the door to this work, and you start asking questions, you start auditing, you start surveying, I just really want to impress upon managers and employers in the audience that transparency around this is paramount. So you may occasionally hear things you don't want to hear, and that's okay. And you have to be responsive. Please be responsive to the folks who have gone out on the limb and opened their hearts to tell you, because they wouldn't have done that unless they thought there was some hope there for meeting you in this relationship and moving forward to a positive place.
Great. And there's several more questions. I'm going to just pose last one, and I apologize that we may go over a minute, but I think this is an important question. So ultimately, the question boils down to how do we strike a balance? So the question is, it feels like to this person that employees are putting their needs above the folks that they serve. And that they feel like we're out of balance in thinking about our own needs versus the needs of the clients that we serve. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that question. If you think there is an out of balance, and if so, how do we get out of balance, or is it not out of balance? And it's, finally that employees, particularly in nonprofit settings and hourly workers, are starting to take more agency in being treated more equitably. So love to hear your thoughts, and that'll be our last question.
Okay, I'll take this one briefly. I do think there are situations that are out of line, and I think it takes you back to the flight attendant saying, if the pressure should drop in the cabin, take the mask and apply it to yourself. Give yourself oxygen first before you meet the needs of others. That is the bottom line in human service agencies that are working to make improvement in the community. Like, we can't be our best for them if we're not doing the best for ourselves. So it's a both and I would just say that briefly.
I agree with that. I would, another way of putting it would be, you can't give what you don't have. And in order to fulfill these most important missions, staff need to be, employees, especially hourly workers, filled up in all the ways that we can help them fill themselves up in order to do the most critical work.
I think we should always, in the context of white supremacy culture, stay mindful of any sort of white supremacist saviorism, right? This idea that, like, in order to be helpful to a community, that we need to somehow kill ourselves or bend ourselves over backwards, and I happen to be from a couple of those communities that many people oftentimes purport to be helping, right? But you step into those offices and you realize it's a very different thing. And I'm not sure that I actually believe that justice is fully served if you help the constituent and not support the employee. I don't know that I would be able to co-sign on that. And the second thing about this is really being mindful of bifurcated ways of thinking, either or thinking, that keep us from seeing the communities that we serve as being both ourselves and others. Right. So we have this way of being like, oh, those are the deserving poor over there. But instead of challenging ourselves to say, how am I connected to the folks that I work with in this community? Because that's what should be bringing us to this work. And prioritizing all of us as a community all at once takes some complexity for sure, but it can be done. And I challenge us all to really think in those ways.
And on that note, I want to say thank you to our panelists, Dr. Bradley, Diane Gould, Karen Groce-Horan. Really appreciated your perspectives, your thoughtfulness to this topic. I want to thank all of the YW staff that were involved in this. And most importantly, I want to thank the participants who gave their time in the focus groups and answered the surveys and gave us this information, because it is extraordinarily rich, and hopefully it's going to provide information so that there can be action at organizations to really make sure that hourly employees, particularly those of marginalized identities, are feeling more integrated in the workforce. So thank you all for your time. I apologize for running over late. And we will be sending out the video and the slides and the report to everyone that participated. So thank you again. This was a really wonderful discussion.